She was 17 years old, wearing a purple dress, dancing with the boy she loved on the happiest night of her life. 3 days later, her body was found in a culvert, discarded like she meant nothing. For 51 years, her killer walked free, lived his life, maybe even smiled when he passed other young girls on the street. But here's what he didn't count on. He didn't count on her refusing to be forgotten. He didn't count on science catching up to evil. And he absolutely didn't count on the fact that some cases, no matter how cold they get, never stop burning. This is the story of Carla Jan Walker, and I need you to stay with me until the very end, because what happens in this story will restore something you might have lost along the way. It's called faith and justice. Before you scroll away, I need you to understand something. Every time you share a story like this, every time you subscribe to channels that refuse to let victims disappear into silence, you become part of something bigger than entertainment. You become part of remembrance. You become part of the reason families never give up. So if this story moves you, if Carla's life matters to you, hit that subscribe button right now and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because Carla deserved to have her story told by millions, not whispered by a few. Now let me take you back to February 1974, to a time when the world looked different, but evil looked exactly the same. Fort Worth, Texas was a sprawling city caught between its cowboy past and an uncertain future. Vietnam was ending, Nixon was crumbling, and teenagers were trying to find moments of joy in a world that felt like it was coming apart at the seams. Carla Walker was one of those teenagers, a junior at Western Hills High School, known for her infectious laugh and her determination to squeeze every drop of happiness out of every single day. She had these eyes that sparkled when she talked about the future. She wanted to be a teacher, wanted to shape young minds, wanted to matter. Her parents, Janet and Jim Walker, had raised her to believe that kindness was strength and that love was the answer to most of life's questions. She believed them. She had no reason not to. Rodney McCoy was her boyfriend, an 18-year-old who looked at Carla like she hung the moon and every star around it. They'd been dating for months, building that kind of teenage love that feels like the whole universe is conspiring to bring two people together. When the Valentine's Day dance came around, there was never any question they'd go together. Carla had spent weeks preparing, finding the perfect purple dress, one that made her feel beautiful and grown up and ready for whatever came next. The dance was everything they'd hoped it would be. Streamers hung from the gymnasium ceiling. A DJ played songs that would become the soundtrack of that era, and couples swayed together under dim lights, believing in forever. Carla and Rodney danced close, laughed loud, and made plans to grab something to eat afterward. They were going to drive to a local bowling alley restaurant, a place teenagers gathered to extend nights they didn't want to end. Around 11:30 that evening, they left the dance and drove to the parking lot of the bowling alley. The restaurant was closed, but the parking lot was a known spot for young couples to sit and talk, to steal kisses, to pretend the world outside the car windows didn't exist. Rodney parked his car, and for a few minutes, they just existed together in that bubble of young love. Then the bubble shattered. A man appeared at the driver's side window, moving fast, moving with purpose. Before Rodney could process what was happening, the man had a gun pointed at his face. The man was commanding, authoritative, and absolutely terrifying. He ordered Rodney out of the car. When Rodney hesitated, the man pistol-whipped him with such force that Rodney collapsed, his skull fractured, his consciousness slipping away into darkness. When Rodney woke up, he was alone. The car was still there, but Carla was gone. Her purple dress, her infectious laugh, her dreams of becoming a teacher, all of it had been ripped away in the time it takes to breathe in and out. Rodney was bleeding, disoriented, barely able to stand. He made his way to find help, his heart already breaking with the guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The police were called. The search began immediately. Officers fanned out across Fort Worth, checking roads, asking questions, hoping that maybe this was a robbery gone wrong and the girl would be dropped off somewhere, shaken but alive. Jim and Janet Walker clung to each other, praying to every god they could name, making bargains with the universe, promising anything for their daughter's safe return. Those prayers would go unanswered. 3 days later, on February 20th, 1974, Carla's body was discovered in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, about 8 miles from where she'd been taken. She was still wearing her purple dress, now torn and dirty. The medical examiner's report would reveal horrors that no family should ever have to hear. Carla had been sexually assaulted. She had been beaten, and she had been strangled to death, her final moments filled with terror and pain and a loneliness no 17-year-old should ever know. Fort Worth went into mourning. Carla's picture was everywhere, her young face staring out from newspapers and television screens, asking a question that had no answer. Why? Why her? Why this girl who wanted nothing more than to dance with her boyfriend and dream about the future? Why this family who had done everything right? The investigation kicked into high gear. Detectives collected evidence from Carla's body, including biological samples that would become crucial decades later. They interviewed everyone who had been at the dance, everyone who lived near the bowling alley, everyone who might have seen something. Tips poured in, some useful, most not. The police followed every lead, chased every shadow, but the killer remained invisible. Rodney McCoy was questioned extensively. His injuries corroborated his story, and he was quickly cleared as a suspect, but the emotional wounds would never heal. He blamed himself for not fighting harder, for not somehow protecting the girl he loved. Survivor's guilt wrapped around his heart like barbed wire, and it would stay there for decades. The Walker family buried their daughter, picked out a headstone that seemed impossibly small for such a big presence, and tried to figure out how to keep breathing in a world that had taken everything from them. They didn't know that their fight for justice was just beginning. They didn't know that the man who killed their daughter was somewhere in Fort Worth, living his life, maybe driving past their house, maybe seeing them grieve and feeling nothing at all. And they certainly didn't know that it would take over 50 years for the truth to finally emerge. In the immediate aftermath of Carla's murder, Fort Worth police worked the case with genuine dedication. Detective Marvin Blackman became the lead investigator, a man who took the death of this 17-year-old personally. He interviewed over 100 people in the first few weeks, building a timeline, creating profiles of potential suspects, trying to understand what kind of monster would target a young couple at a bowling alley parking lot on Valentine's Day. The weapon used to strike Rodney was never recovered. The gun the attacker had pointed at him was never found. But the biological evidence collected from Carla's body was carefully preserved, stored according to the protocols of the time, waiting for a future that didn't exist yet. In 1974, DNA testing was still science fiction. Detectives had to rely on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence they could see and touch, and old-fashioned investigative work. Several suspects emerged in those early months. Men with histories of violence against women. Men who had been seen in the area that night. Men who made neighbors uncomfortable for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Each lead was pursued, each suspect was investigated, and each time, the evidence failed to connect anyone definitively to Carla's murder. Rodney McCoy was a haunted young man walking through his days like a ghost. He cooperated fully with police, answered every question, relived that night over and over in interview rooms and in his nightmares. He described the attacker as a white male, stocky build, aggressive demeanor, someone who moved like he'd done this before. But in the darkness of that parking lot, with terror flooding his system, Rodney couldn't provide enough detail for a composite sketch that would break the case open. The Walker family became advocates for keeping Carla's case in the public eye. Jim Walker, in particular, refused to let the investigation fade into the background. He called the police department regularly, met with detectives, pushed for updates. He wasn't belligerent or demanding, just persistent. He carried a photograph of Carla in his wallet, and when people asked about it, he told them her story. He believed that somewhere out there, someone knew something. Months turned into years. Detective Blackman retired, and the case was handed off to new investigators who had their own active cases to handle. The file on Carla Walker grew dusty, but was never closed. In Texas, there is no statute of limitations on murder, which meant that technically, the case could be solved at any time. But practically, as witnesses died and memories faded, the likelihood of justice seemed to diminish with each passing year. The 1980s came and went. The 1990s brought new technologies, including the emergence of DNA testing as a tool for law enforcement. In 1994, the biological evidence from Carla's case was tested using the DNA analysis methods available at the time. A profile was developed, a genetic fingerprint of the killer, but there was no match in any database. The profile was stored, added to CODIS, the combined DNA index system, but the hit that everyone hoped for never came. The Walker family continued their vigil. Jim Walker passed away in 2002, never knowing who killed his daughter. Janet Walker carried on alone, attending occasional meetings with detectives, always asking the same question with different words. Any progress? She kept Carla's room largely unchanged, a shrine to the girl who would forever be 17. She marked the anniversary of Carla's death every year, sometimes with other family members, sometimes alone, always with grief that time had refused to diminish. In Fort Worth, the case became legendary among law enforcement. New detectives learned about it during training, studied it as an example of the challenges posed by cold cases. Carla Walker's name was spoken in hallways, her photograph displayed in presentations about unsolved homicides. She had become a symbol, both of tragedy and of unfinished business. Rodney McCoy, meanwhile, tried to build a life around the hole in his heart. He married, had children, built a career. But he never forgot that night, never stopped wondering what he could have done differently. He stayed in contact with the Walker family, bound to them by shared trauma. They didn't blame him for what happened, not really, but the connection between them was always shadowed by the ghost of the girl they'd all loved. By 2019, genetic genealogy had emerged as a revolutionary tool for solving cold cases. The technique, which combined DNA evidence with public genealogy databases, had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, making headlines around the world. Suddenly, cases that had seemed unsolvable were being cracked open, one after another. Investigators everywhere began submitting old evidence for this new kind of analysis. The Fort Worth Police Department's cold case unit, led by Detective Leah Wagner, decided to revisit Carla Walker's case. Wagner was a dedicated investigator who had joined the department years after Carla's murder, but had become personally invested in finding answers. She reached out to Othram, a private laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. The biological evidence from 1974 was submitted for testing. What came back was remarkable. Despite being nearly 50 years old, the samples yielded a usable DNA profile. Othram scientists were able to build a family tree using genetic genealogy, tracing the killer's DNA through distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to public databases. The process took months of painstaking work. Genealogists built family trees going back generations, looking for connections, eliminating branches, narrowing down the possibilities. Finally, in September 2020, they had a name: Glen Samuel McCurley. McCurley was 77 years old, living in Fort Worth, the same city where he had committed his crime 51 years earlier. He had been there the whole time, hiding in plain sight, aging and presumably forgetting while the Walker family had aged and never forgotten. Detective Wagner and her team now had a suspect, but they needed confirmation before they could make an arrest. The next phase of the investigation required getting a fresh DNA sample from McCurley to compare against the evidence from 1974. This is a delicate process, legally and practically. Investigators couldn't just knock on his door and demand he submit to testing. They needed to be clever. Surveillance was established. Investigators watched McCurley's movements, waiting for an opportunity to collect what's called abandoned DNA, genetic material left behind on items a person discards in public. It's perfectly legal and has been used in numerous cases to confirm suspects identified through genetic genealogy. In September 2020, investigators followed McCurley to a restaurant. When he finished his meal and left, they moved in and collected items he had used, including a cup and a fork. The items were rushed to the lab for testing. The results came back as a match. After 51 years, they had found Carla Walker's killer. On September 21, 2020, Fort Worth police officers approached the home of Glen Samuel McCurley. The house was unremarkable, the kind of place you drive past without a second glance, the kind of place where you'd never expect a monster to be living out his final years. McCurley came to the door, 77 years old, gray-haired, looking like any other grandfather you might see at a grocery store or a church service. But investigators knew what they knew. They asked McCurley if he would be willing to talk to them about an old case. Perhaps surprisingly, he agreed. He was taken to a police interview room, where Detective Wagner and her colleagues were waiting with decades of questions and one undeniable piece of evidence. His DNA matched the DNA found on Carla Walker's body in 1974. What happened in that interview room over the next several hours would reveal the truth of what happened on that February night, confirming the worst suspicions while also providing details that had never been known. McCurley, confronted with scientific evidence he couldn't deny, began to talk. He admitted to being at the bowling alley parking lot that night. He admitted to approaching Rodney McCoy's car with a pistol. He admitted to striking Rodney and taking Carla. And then, in words that must have been excruciating for investigators to hear, he described what he did to that 17-year-old girl. According to McCurley, he had been drinking that night and was looking for someone to assault. He saw the young couple in the car and made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. After incapacitating Rodney, he forced Carla into his vehicle at gunpoint. He drove her to a remote area where he sexually assaulted her. Then he strangled her. He described her death with a detachment that chilled everyone in the room. Carla had fought back, had tried to survive, had scratched and struggled until she couldn't anymore. When it was over, McCurley drove to the culvert near Benbrook Lake and left her body there, discarded and alone. Then he went home and continued his life as if nothing had happened. For 51 years. When confronted with the enormity of what he had done, when asked how he had lived with himself all those years, McCurley offered explanations that satisfied no one. He had tried not to think about it. He had convinced himself that what happened was somehow not as bad as it was. He had buried the memory and built a life on top of the grave. He had gotten married. He had worked jobs. He had celebrated holidays and attended barbecues and grown old in a community that had no idea what he was capable of. Meanwhile, the Walker family had grieved every single day. Rodney McCoy had carried guilt that was never his to bear. And Carla had remained 17 forever, frozen in that purple dress, frozen in death. Let me pause here to ask you something important. How do you think you would feel if you discovered that someone you knew, maybe a neighbor, maybe a colleague, maybe even a family member, had been hiding a monstrous secret for decades? Would you wonder how they could have seemed so normal? Would you question your own ability to judge character? I want you to leave a comment below and tell me what you think, because understanding how predators hide in plain sight might just protect someone you love someday. McCurley was arrested and charged with capital murder. At 77, he faced the possibility of spending whatever remained of his life in prison. The death penalty was technically on the table, but prosecutors would ultimately make a different calculation, one focused on guaranteeing justice rather than risking the uncertainties of a trial. The news of the arrest spread quickly through Fort Worth and beyond. The cold case community, those dedicated individuals who follow unsolved murders and advocate for victims, celebrated another victory for genetic genealogy. But for those closest to Carla, the emotions were more complicated. Janet Walker was still alive when the arrest was made. She was elderly now, had spent the majority of her life waiting for this moment, had buried her husband without ever knowing who had killed their daughter. When she was informed that an arrest had been made, she reportedly wept. Not tears of joy, exactly, but tears of something like completion. The monster finally had a face and a name. Rodney McCoy, now in his 60s, received the news with a mixture of relief and renewed grief. The man who had taken Carla from him had been identified. The nightmare that had started in that parking lot had reached some kind of ending. But nothing could give him back the life he might have had if that night had never happened. Nothing could give him back Carla. The community of Fort Worth reacted with shock and fascination. Many remembered the case, remembered the fear that had gripped the city in 1974. Some had attended school with Carla. Others had been teenagers themselves at the time, had been warned by their parents to be careful, had felt the shadow of a killer moving through their city. Now they knew who had cast that shadow. The media descended on the story, and details about McCurley's life began to emerge. He had lived a largely unremarkable existence, at least on the surface. There were no other known victims, though investigators acknowledged they couldn't be certain he hadn't committed other crimes. The assault on Carla had been horrific enough to suggest a deep capacity for violence, the kind that rarely manifests just once. As the legal process moved forward, prosecutors assembled their case. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, a 1 in trillions match that left no room for reasonable doubt. McCurley's own statements corroborated his guilt. Witnesses from 1974, those still living, were contacted and interviewed again. The case against Glen Samuel McCurley was as close to airtight as any case could be. But justice, as anyone who has dealt with the criminal system knows, is never guaranteed. The defense could raise challenges, could question evidence handling, could try to exploit any weakness in the prosecution's case. The Walker family, who had waited 51 years, would have to wait a little longer. The months following McCurley's arrest were a strange limbo for everyone involved. The pandemic was raging, courts were backed up, and legal proceedings moved at a pace that must have felt agonizing to a family that had already spent 5 decades waiting. But prosecutors were methodical, building their case brick by brick, ensuring that when they went to trial or negotiated a plea, the outcome would be certain. Detective Wagner continued her work, coordinating with prosecutors, managing evidence, and keeping the Walker family informed. She had become their advocate, their connection to a system that can often feel impersonal and cold. She understood that for Janet Walker, this wasn't just a case number. This was her child. Behind the scenes, plea negotiations were taking place. McCurley's attorneys understood the strength of the evidence against their client. A trial would almost certainly result in conviction, and given the nature of the crime, a Texas jury might very well impose the harshest penalty available. The question was whether a plea deal could be structured that would guarantee punishment while avoiding the uncertainties of trial. For prosecutors, the calculation involved several factors. Janet Walker was in her 90s. A lengthy trial, with appeals and delays, might stretch for years. There was a very real possibility that she would not live to see a final verdict if the case went to trial. Additionally, even the strongest case can encounter unexpected problems. Witnesses can be challenged, evidence can be questioned, and juries can be unpredictable. A plea deal, while potentially criticized as lenient, would guarantee conviction and punishment. It would provide closure for the family within a time frame that meant something. It would ensure that McCurley officially acknowledged his guilt, that the record would forever show that he was Carla Walker's killer. Ultimately, that's the path that was chosen. In April 2021, Glen Samuel McCurley pleaded guilty to the 1974 murder of Carla Jan Walker. In exchange for the plea, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 77 years old, McCurley would die behind bars, never again knowing freedom. The courtroom that day was filled with emotion. Janet Walker was there, frail but determined, facing the man who had stolen her daughter's life. Other family members surrounded her, a wall of support for a woman who had carried this burden for longer than many of them had been alive. Rodney McCoy was present, finally able to look at the face of the man who had destroyed his youth. When given the opportunity to address the court, family members delivered impact statements that laid bare the devastation McCurley had caused. They spoke of Carla's dreams, of her laughter, of all the milestones she had been denied. They spoke of the long years of not knowing, of the toll that uncertainty had taken on their family. They spoke of holidays haunted by an empty chair, of grandchildren Carla would never have, of a lifetime of grief that never diminished. McCurley sat and listened, or at least appeared to. Whether he felt genuine remorse or was simply playing a role, no one could say for certain. But what he felt mattered less than what the court declared. He was a convicted murderer. He would spend his remaining days in prison, and Carla Walker's case was finally, officially, closed. After the sentencing, Janet Walker spoke to reporters briefly. She expressed relief that it was over, gratitude to the investigators who had never given up, and continued grief for the daughter she had lost. She said she could now visit Jim's grave and tell him that they had found the man who killed Carla. It was a bittersweet victory, the kind that comes too late to undo the damage but not too late to matter. Rodney McCoy also addressed the media. He spoke about the guilt he had carried, the feeling that he should have done more, the decades of self-doubt. With the case now closed, he said he felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness for McCurley, never that, but perhaps a release of some of the weight he had been carrying. The truth was finally known. The question that had haunted him since 1974 had been answered. Detective Wagner received commendations for her work on the case. She deflected praise, saying that the real credit belonged to the original investigators who had preserved the evidence, to the scientists who had developed the technology, and to the forensic genealogists who had built the family tree that led to McCurley. She said she was just glad to have been part of the team that brought Carla home. The cold case community celebrated another win for genetic genealogy. Carla Walker's case became a reference point, cited in discussions about the power of this new technology to solve cases that had seemed unsolvable. Advocates for victims' rights pointed to her story as evidence that no case should ever be considered hopeless, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. But for those who had known Carla, the celebrations were muted. They had won, but what had they won? An old man in prison, a conviction on paper, an acknowledgement that their daughter, their girlfriend, their friend had mattered. It was something, but it could never be enough. Nothing could bring Carla back. In the aftermath of McCurley's conviction, attention turned to understanding not just what happened, but why it had taken so long to solve. The case became a study in both the limitations of 1970s forensic science and the remarkable capabilities of modern genetic technology. It also raised questions about how many other killers might be hiding in plain sight, waiting to be caught by techniques that hadn't existed when they committed their crimes. The forensic evidence preserved from 1974 had been crucial. Investigators at the time had collected biological samples from Carla's body, properly stored them, and maintained the chain of custody for over 5 decades. This was not always the case in historical investigations. Many cold cases remain unsolved because evidence was mishandled, lost, or degraded beyond usefulness. Carla Walker's investigators deserved credit for their diligence. DNA technology had advanced dramatically over the years. In 1994, when the first DNA testing was done on the evidence, the methods could only generate a basic profile. This profile didn't match anyone in the criminal databases of the time. CODIS, the National DNA Database, was still in its infancy, and McCurley's DNA was not in the system because he had never been convicted of a felony that required DNA collection. Genetic genealogy changed everything. By combining DNA evidence with publicly available genealogy databases, investigators could now identify suspects through their relatives. McCurley's DNA matched family members who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to services like GeneMatch. From those matches, genealogists built family trees until they could narrow down the suspect pool. This approach raises privacy concerns that are still being debated. When individuals upload their DNA to genealogy sites, they may inadvertently expose their relatives to law enforcement scrutiny. Some argue this is a necessary tool for solving serious crimes. Others worry about surveillance overreach and the erosion of privacy rights. The debate continues, but for Carla Walker's family, the technology was a godsend. McCurley's successful escape from justice for so long also illustrated the limitations of witness-based identification. Rodney McCoy had described the attacker in 1974, but his description was not specific enough to identify one person among thousands. Composite sketches were attempted but failed to generate leads. Without physical evidence linking a specific person to the crime, the investigation had stalled. The psychology of a killer who evades capture for decades is also worth examining. McCurley had managed to compartmentalize his crime, apparently living a relatively normal life while carrying the secret of murder. Psychologists who study such individuals note that this compartmentalization is not unusual. Killers often create mental barriers that allow them to function in society while suppressing their violent acts. Some theorize that McCurley may have felt invincible as the years passed without arrest. Each passing year without consequence might have reinforced his belief that he had gotten away with it. The idea that science might one day catch up to him may not have occurred to him until it was too late. His decision to speak with investigators in 2020 suggested he either underestimated the evidence against him or had grown tired of running from his own conscience. For the Walker family, understanding why took a back seat to dealing with what. What now? What meaning could they extract from 51 years of waiting? How do you move forward when moving forward has been defined by a quest for justice that has now ended? Janet Walker continued to live in Fort Worth, surrounded by family members who had never known Carla but had grown up in the shadow of her absence. She visited Carla's grave regularly, brought flowers, talked to her daughter as if she could hear. Some might call this morbid, but for Janet, it was connection. It was maintaining a relationship that death had interrupted but not ended. The broader Walker family found their own ways to honor Carla's memory. Some advocated for victims' rights, sharing their story to encourage funding for cold case investigations. Others supported organizations that helped families of unsolved homicides cope with their unique grief. Carla's name appeared on memorial walls and in scholarship funds, her legacy repurposed into something that helped others. Rodney McCoy, finally freed from the mystery, worked on releasing the guilt that had shaped so much of his life. He sought counseling, talked openly about his experiences, and tried to find peace. He said in interviews that he would always love Carla, that she was his first true love, and that part of him would remain 17 years old, dancing with her at that Valentine's Day dance forever. The investigators who had worked the case over the years received recognition they hadn't sought, but richly deserved. Detective Blackman, the original lead investigator, had passed away years earlier, never knowing that the case would eventually be solved. Detective Wagner spoke at conferences about genetic genealogy, using Carla's case as an example of perseverance paying off. For Fort Worth, the closure of the case was a collective exhale. A monster who had walked among them for half a century was now caged. But the city also had to reckon with uncomfortable questions. How many other McCurleys were out there? How many unsolved cases from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s might be cracked with new technology? The work was far from over. The conviction of Glen McCurley sent ripples through the world of cold case investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice, submitting their own decades-old evidence for genetic genealogy analysis. The technology that had seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier was now becoming standard practice, a routine tool in the fight against historical crimes. Families of other victims watched Carla Walker's case with a mixture of hope and envy. They wondered if their loved ones might be next, if the technology that had caught McCurley might also catch the killers who had taken their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. Cold case advocacy groups saw an increase in inquiries, donations, and volunteer interest. The ethical debates around genetic genealogy intensified as well. Privacy advocates pointed out that innocent people were having their genetic information used without their consent to identify their relatives. Law enforcement countered that the technique was only used for serious crimes, typically murder and sexual assault, and that the privacy interests of victims outweighed the privacy concerns of distant relatives of criminals. Various states began passing laws regulating the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Some required court orders before the technique could be employed. Others limited which databases could be accessed. The legal landscape was evolving, trying to balance the remarkable power of the technology with legitimate concerns about civil liberties. For the genealogists who did this work, cases like Carla Walker's were deeply meaningful. These were not abstract puzzles, but real lives, real families, real grief. Building a family tree that led to a murderer was intellectually challenging work, but it was also emotionally weighty. Many genealogists reported being affected by the cases they worked on, carrying the stories with them. The companies that provided genetic genealogy services, like Othram, found themselves in a unique position. They were private businesses that had become essential partners in criminal justice. Their laboratories processed evidence, their algorithms analyzed data, and their scientists testified in court. It was a new frontier, and they were navigating it in real time. McCurley's case also highlighted the importance of victim advocacy within the criminal justice system. The Walker family had been fortunate to have Detective Wagner, who had communicated with them regularly and treated their concerns with respect. But many families of cold case victims described feeling forgotten, their cases languishing in filing cabinets while detectives focused on active investigations. Advocacy organizations pushed for dedicated cold case units within police departments, staffed with detectives whose sole focus was unsolved homicides. They argued that victims like Carla Walker deserved the same investigative attention as fresh cases, that the passage of time should not diminish the commitment to justice. Some departments heeded this call, others pleaded budget constraints. The psychological impact of long unresolved cases on families became a subject of academic study. Researchers documented a specific type of grief, sometimes called ambiguous loss, that afflicted those whose loved ones were murdered but whose killers remained unknown. This grief was complicated by hope, by anger, by the frustration of seeing anniversaries pass without answers. When cases were finally solved, families often experienced a mix of relief and a resurgence of acute grief, as if the wound were being opened fresh. Janet Walker exemplified this complex emotional journey. In interviews following McCurley's conviction, she spoke about feeling lighter but also feeling sadder. The conviction had confirmed what she had always known, that her daughter had suffered terribly. It had put a face to the evil that had invaded her family. The monster was no longer abstract but specific, and that specificity brought its own kind of horror. The question of whether McCurley had other victims was investigated but never conclusively answered. He denied killing anyone else, but his denials carried little weight given that he had lied by omission for 51 years. Investigators reviewed unsolved cases from the 1970s and 1980s in the Fort Worth area, looking for any connections to McCurley. None were definitively established, but cold case investigators know that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The impact of Carla Walker's case extended into the realm of education. Criminal justice programs began incorporating genetic genealogy into their curricula, teaching the next generation of investigators about techniques that hadn't existed when their professors were in school. The case was used as a teaching example, illustrating both the potential and the limitations of the technology. Some defense attorneys raised concerns about the reliability of genetic genealogy evidence, arguing that it was newer and less tested than traditional DNA matching. These arguments generally failed in court, as the scientific foundations of the technique were sound. But the legal challenges ensured that the technology would be rigorously examined, that any weaknesses would be identified and addressed. The media attention surrounding McCurley's arrest and conviction brought renewed interest in true crime. Podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and authors explored Carla Walker's story, each bringing their own perspective to the narrative. This attention was a double-edged sword. It kept Carla's memory alive, but also risked sensationalizing her suffering for entertainment purposes. As the immediate intensity of the case subsided, those involved began the long process of integrating this chapter into their lives. For the Walker family, this meant finding new rhythms now that the drumbeat of seeking justice had finally stopped. For investigators, it meant moving on to other cases while carrying the lessons of this one. For the community, it meant absorbing what had happened and trying to make sense of it. Janet Walker continued to live with the presence of her daughter, both in memory and in spirit. She kept photographs of Carla throughout her home, spoke about her often, and encouraged younger family members to remember an aunt they had never met. She attended victim advocacy events when her health permitted, sharing her story to inspire others and to keep Carla's case from fading into obscurity. The Walker family established a scholarship fund in Carla's name, supporting young women pursuing careers in education, the field Carla had dreamed of entering. Each year, recipients were selected and celebrated, their achievements a living tribute to the 17-year-old whose life was cut short. The scholarship program ensured that Carla's name would be associated with hope and possibility, not just tragedy. Rodney McCoy finally allowed himself to grieve fully, something he had suppressed for decades. He wrote about his experiences, participated in documentaries, and spoke at events about the impact of violent crime on survivors. He became an advocate for others in similar situations, using his platform to push for better support systems for those affected by violence. The marriage he had built over the years remained strong, but the resolution of the case required adjustment. His wife had known about Carla, had understood that part of her husband's heart was locked away in the past. Now that past had been opened, examined, and somewhat resolved, they navigated this new terrain together, as partners who had weathered many storms. Detective Wagner moved on to other cold cases, applying the lessons she had learned from the Walker investigation. She became a mentor to younger detectives, emphasizing the importance of evidence preservation, family communication, and persistence. She was invited to speak at conferences, where she shared insights that might help solve other long-dormant cases. The technology that had solved Carla's case continued to evolve. New methods were developed that could extract usable DNA from even more degraded samples. Databases grew larger as more people voluntarily uploaded their genetic information. The pool of potential matches expanded, meaning more cold cases could potentially be solved. Law enforcement agencies that had initially been skeptical of genetic genealogy became enthusiastic adopters. Budgets were allocated, partnerships were formed, and cases that had seemed hopeless were reopened. The success of cases like Carla Walker's created momentum that carried into departments across the country. But not everything was progress. Some families of cold case victims faced disappointment when genetic genealogy failed to identify their loved one's killers. Not every case had preserved evidence. Not every killer had identifiable relatives in the databases. The technology was powerful but not magical, and managing expectations became an important part of the process. The philosophical questions raised by these cases persisted. What does justice mean when it comes so late? Does convicting an elderly man provide the same satisfaction as convicting him when he was young? Can any punishment truly fit a crime like the murder of a 17-year-old girl? These questions had no easy answers, but asking them was part of processing what had happened. For the broader public, Carla Walker's story served as both cautionary tale and inspiration. It reminded people that evil exists, that monsters hide behind ordinary faces, and that no parking lot is completely safe. But it also demonstrated that science advances, that dedication persists, and that victims are not forgotten. The story carried darkness and light in equal measure. The impact on Fort Worth was subtle but real. Residents who had lived through the fear of 1974 found a measure of closure. Parents who had warned their children about the dangers of the world could point to a case where justice, however delayed, prevailed. The city's law enforcement felt validated in their commitment to never closing a case until it was truly solved. Memorials to Carla Walker were maintained and updated. Her grave remained a place of pilgrimage for those who had known her and those who simply felt connected to her story. Flowers appeared regularly, left by visitors who wanted to honor a girl who had become a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. The legal finality of McCurley's conviction meant that appeals were unlikely to succeed. He would die in prison, and that outcome was as certain as any outcome in the criminal justice system could be. The Walker family could rest assured that their pursuit of justice had reached its conclusion, that there were no more battles to fight in courtrooms. Time moves differently when justice has been served. For the Walker family, the years following McCurley's conviction were marked by a gradual shift from active grief to integrated memory. Carla remained present in their lives, but her presence took on new dimensions. She was no longer just a victim awaiting justice. She was a young woman whose brief life had mattered and whose death had ultimately led to meaning. Janet Walker lived long enough to see justice done and to process its complicated aftermath. She spoke until the end of her life about her daughter, about the pain of loss, and about the gratitude she felt toward everyone who had helped solve the case. When she passed away, surrounded by family, she was buried near Jim and near Carla, reuniting in death the family that had been so devastated in 1974. At her funeral, speakers noted that Janet had spent more years seeking justice for Carla than Carla had spent living. This statistic, stark and sobering, illustrated both the tragedy of what had been lost and the determination of those left behind. Janet's persistence had been remarkable, a testament to maternal love that transcended decades. The Walker family continues to gather annually on the anniversary of Carla's death, not just to mourn but to celebrate. They share stories about Carla, about Janet and Jim, about the long journey to justice. New generations attend these gatherings, learning about an aunt and great-aunt they never met, understanding their family's history and the values it represents. Rodney McCoy found peace in his later years. He spoke openly about having forgiven himself for being unable to protect Carla that night. He acknowledged that the guilt he had carried was never truly his, that he had been a victim too, and that surviving was not a betrayal but a gift. He honored Carla's memory by living fully, by loving his family deeply, and by helping others who had experienced similar trauma. The scholarship fund in Carla's name continues to support young women pursuing education degrees. Each recipient learns about the girl whose name they carry forward, understanding that their achievements are part of a legacy of turning tragedy into hope. Many have gone on to become teachers, shaping young minds just as Carla had dreamed of doing. Detective Wagner retired with a distinguished career behind her. She remains connected to the cold case community, occasionally consulting on difficult investigations and speaking at events. She considers the Walker case one of the most meaningful of her career, a reminder of why she chose this profession and what it can achieve when persistence meets technology. Glen Samuel McCurley died in prison in 2022, less than 2 years after his conviction. He was 79 years old. His death was not announced widely, and no one mourned publicly. He passed from the world having faced consequences for his actions, having lost his freedom and his anonymity, having been identified for all history as the monster who killed Carla Walker. His death provided a final measure of closure for some. The Walker family could now be certain he would never walk free, would never harm another person, would never escape the judgment that had finally caught up to him. Justice had been served, and the universe had balanced its scales in whatever small way it could. For Fort Worth and beyond, Carla Walker's case remains a reference point. It is cited in discussions about cold cases, genetic genealogy, and the importance of never giving up. Her name appears in academic papers, in true crime discussions, and in law enforcement training materials. She has become more than a victim. She has become a symbol of what persistence and science can achieve together. The story of Carla Jan Walker ends not with her murder, but with her legacy. A 17-year-old girl who wanted to dance, to love, and to teach became, through the cruelty of one man and the determination of many others, a catalyst for justice. Her case helped advance techniques that have since solved countless other homicides. Her family's refusal to give up inspired others facing similar nightmares. And in the end, that is the victory. Not that Glen McCurley was caught, though that mattered. Not that he died in prison, though that provided satisfaction. The victory is that Carla Walker is remembered, that her name means something, that her brief life continues to ripple through time in ways she could never have imagined. Every time a cold case is solved using genetic genealogy, Carla's spirit is present. Every time a family of an unsolved homicide victim refuses to give up hope, they walk the same path the Walkers walked. Every time science catches up to evil, it builds on the foundation laid by cases like this one. Carla wanted to be a teacher. In a way, she became one. Her case teaches us about the endurance of love, the power of determination, and the possibility that justice, however delayed, can still arrive. It teaches us that monsters can be caught, that victims can be remembered, and that families can find something like peace even after unimaginable loss. She was 17 years old, wearing a purple dress, dancing with the boy she loved. She deserved a full life, and she was robbed of it. But she was not forgotten. She was never forgotten. And now, Her killer has faced judgment, her family has found closure, and her story has reached its proper end. Not with darkness, but with light. Not with despair, but with hope. Not with silence, but with a voice that echoes through the years, reminding us all that every life matters. Every victim deserves justice. In some cases, no matter how cold they get, never stop burning until the truth finally sets them free. This is for Carla. This is for Janet and Jim. This is for Rodney. This is for everyone who waits in darkness for justice to arrive. It arrived,